Introduction. Neuromarketing is a distinctive approach to market research because it's based on new knowledge and findings from the brain sciences. This rich and rapidly growing body of knowledge provides many new perspectives on understanding consumer behavior. We call this new view of the consumer the intuitive consumer model, as opposed to the rational consumer model that underlies most traditional market research. In this section, we offer an overview of some of the key findings that underlie the intuitive consumer model and neuromarketing. Brain science tells us that the typical consumer is not a slow and careful deliberation when it comes to buying preferences and decisions, but instead is a cognitive miser equipped with a brain that is adapted by evolution to conserve energy and produce fast and efficient consumer decisions and actions, not deep and logical representation of opportunities arising in the department of purchases and messages born out of marketing strategies. Our consumer brains are attracted to both the new and the familiar, and they prefer the simple to the complex. These propensities are built into the circuitry of the brain, and they most often impact us below the level of conscious awareness. This new picture of the human brain changes our understanding of how people see and interpret the world around them. This understanding has many implications for market research, which we introduce in Chapter 2 and cover in detail in Chapter 5. The most important of these implications is that human beings actually have very little awareness of why they do the things they do. This means that when people are asked by researchers about what they like or what they'll buy in the future, their answers are often guesses about what they think and what they may do. These guesses have been shown to be no more reliable and accurate than the guesses people make every day about what other people are thinking or going to do. People aren't lying or trying to deceive researchers when they make these guesses. They are literally unaware of the real causes and reasons for their actions. This finding sets the fundamental challenge for market research. It's also the reason that neuromarketing has emerged in market research, because neuromarketing techniques hold the promise of measuring consumer responses that occur below the level of conscious awareness. Many additional insights flow from this new science-based picture of the intuitive consumer. We focus on three more aspects of this picture in this present script: how emotions impact consumer decisions and behavior, how non-conscious goals drive decisions and actions. Emotions operate at both conscious and non-conscious levels. They deeply impact our perceptions, beliefs, and attitudes, even when we aren't aware of them. They heavily influence what we notice by directing attention, as well as what we remember by triggering memory. We cover this topic thoroughly. The way in which our brains direct us toward any kind of decision and action, including consumer decisions and actions, is through the activation, pursuit, and attainment of goals. This is the basis of the motivational system that drives us, a system that has evolved over millions of years. What we've learned from brain science, mostly in the last decade, is that goals can operate non-consciously as well as consciously. Contrary to our conscious experience, we are constantly activating and pursuing goals that we may have no idea exist. This finding has huge implications for marketing and consumer behavior for both marketers and consumers. We consider these implications. We used to see decision-making as a conscious, deliberative process that could be reconstructed simply by asking a person to recount how he or she came to a particular decision. Today we know that people use different systems in the brain to make different kinds of decisions, and that many decisions occur automatically below the threshold of one's awareness and one's consciousness as well. Consumer decisions are also highly influenced by situational factors, such as how a product is presented in a store or what other products it sits next to. These situational effects have been studied extensively in the new field of behavioral economics. A large body of research shows that these effects also often occur without conscious awareness of their impact. With so many non-conscious influences on consumer decision-making being uncovered, we need to take a new look at the power of traditional persuasion in marketing and advertising. We find that persuasion is probably less important in successful marketing and advertising than it was previously believed to be. Chapter 4 looks at consumer decision-making in detail. Neuromarketing is built on these insights and many others derived from brain science. It borrows the tools and technologies developed in the brain sciences and applies them to the world of marketing and consumer behavior. The underlying science will continue to progress, and neuromarketing will continue to benefit from this vibrant scientific foundation. Chapter 1: Uses and Measurement. Where is neuromarketing used? Neuromarketing is being used today by marketers in many research areas. Also, we tell you how it's being used, what results are being achieved, and how it's likely to be used in the future in 6 key marketing areas. Brand. Brands are essentially ideas in the mind, and they draw their strength by making connections with other ideas in the mind. Later, we need to see how strong connections in long-term memory make leading brands so hard to displace. We also show how neuromarketing techniques can be used to measure brand effects that consumers may not even know exist. Product. Product innovation and package design are 2 research areas in which neuromarketing is making significant inroads. Because people have a hard time predicting what they like or do in the future, neuromarketing provides alternative ways to observe when a new idea is resonating positively with consumers and when it's generating a gigantic "huh." We cover these and other uses of neuromarketing in product and package research. Advertising. How advertising works and what makes one ad more successful than another have always been a bit of a mystery. Neuromarketing offers new tools and techniques that illuminate, if not completely solve, this mystery. In particular, brain science leads us to the intriguing idea that ads may work best when they aren't paid attention to, and that the repetition of positive emotional connections, rather than persuasive messaging, may be more effective at reinforcing brands and boosting sales. We discuss these and other ideas about ads and the brain. Shopping. Shoppers expend surprisingly little conscious thought in the shopping experience. They pick up a huge number of visual and other sensory cues as they navigate their shopping journey, but they usually aren't aware of most of them. Situational factors are highly influential in determining shopping outcomes, often at the expense of shoppers' conscious intentions. How neuromarketing can be used to test shopper reactions in both real and simulated shopping environments is covered. Online. Closely related to in-store shopping experience is online shopping experience, but there are important differences. In the online world, advertising and buying can exist right next to each other, with no need for consumers to delay gratification until they make their next trip down to the mall. As a result, the activation, pursuit, and attainment or frustration of consumer goals is much more immediate and dynamic in online shopping. Entertainment. The final marketing area we explore in Part 3 is entertainment. Although people are better able to identify when they're being entertained than when they're being persuaded, they have very little conscious access to why they find one TV program, movie or video game more entertaining than another. Brain science provides some useful insights into what makes a story interesting and how interest is represented in the brain. This opens up the possibility of neuromarketing testing of entertainment programming. We also look at this research. Measuring consumer responses in neuromarketing. Next, we shift our focus from sources and applications of neuromarketing to the basics of neuromarketing testing, how neuromarketing measurement techniques differ from traditional market research and from each other, and how they've been adapted from the tools and technologies of brain science. First, we emphasize that although neuromarketers criticize some assumptions underlying traditional market research, there remains an important place for these approaches. We review the 3 workhorses of market research: interviews, focus groups, and surveys, and discuss when they make sense and when they present limitations and risks. Looking at the new neuromarketing research tools and techniques, we see in Chapter 16 that they fall into two general categories: approaches that measure responses of the body to marketing, and approaches that measure responses of the brain. Each approach captures a different kind of signal, and each comes with a different set of pros and cons as a measurement technology. As part of our detailed studies, we review these methods too. The most important psychological or biometric measures based on body signals used in neuromarketing include the following: facial expressions. The human face registers a lot of different and varied emotional states. Facial expressions can be read at two levels: observable changes in expressions, for example smiles or frowns, and unobservable micromuscle changes. Facial expression measures have been found to be robust indicators of positive or negative emotional responses, called emotional valence. Eye tracking. The measurement of the detailed pupil dilation and also of eye movements while viewing or looking an object or scene. Eye tracking has many uses in neuromarketing, both as an independent tool and as a supplement to other measures. The speed and direction of changes in gaze patterns provide valuable indicators of attention, interest, and attraction. Electrodermal activity. A measure of a person's perspiration on his or her skin, which is usually measured by observing the formation at the fingertips. The signal increases with increased emotional arousal, stimulation or excitation of the nervous system. A limitation of this measure is that it cannot distinguish between positive and negative emotional valence. Respiration and heart rate. These measures focus on the beating speed of the heart and how deep and fast a person is breathing. Heart rate has been found to slow down momentarily when attention increases. Response time. One way that non-conscious brain processes reveal themselves in behavior is by facilitating or interfering with the speed of response to word comparisons or visual choices. Response time measures provide a simple and accessible way to test the strength of association between different concepts. They've been used successfully by neuromarketers in brand, product, and package testing. Neurological or neurometric measures, based on brain signals, tend to be both more complex and more accurate than body measures. Sometimes the extra effort and cost associated with these technologies is worth it, other times not. It depends on the research question being asked. 3 brain signal techniques are commonly talked about in discussions of neurological neuromarketing measures. Functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI. This technique is the favorite of academic researchers because it enables the precise imaging of activity anywhere in the brain. It does this by measuring blood flow. When parts of the brain become active, blood flows to them. Because blood contains iron, this flow can be traced by a massive magnet that surrounds the head of the person being studied. fMRI machines are very expensive but are available at most hospitals, universities, and independent imaging centers. They're indispensable for testing theories about how the brain works, but some neuromarketers consider fMRI because of its cost, complexity, and artificial testing environment to be overkill for market research testing. Electroencephalography, EEG. Probably the most popular neuromarketing technology because of its relatively low cost and manageable equipment requirements, EEG measures the strength at the scalp of very small electrical fields generated by brain activity. It's a well-established technology that benefits from a massive academic literature. The biggest limitation of EEG is that it can't reliably measure changes in electrical activity deep in the brain. Magnetoencephalography, MEG. This is a special technique to measure the smallest of changes, minute changes, in and around the magnetic fields produced by the brain. It has many advantages, but requires multi-million-dollar machinery that must be supercooled to near absolute zero to operate. It's used in academic studies, but hasn't caught on as a particular method for commercial neuromarketing. All these techniques are discussed in detail. We also need to discuss how some leading companies are integrating different types of research, both neuromarketing and traditional, within a unified organizational structure to provide a single integrated, multidimensional view of consumer interests and behaviors. All detailed study should be devoted to the topic of neuromarketing on a budget. We describe 3 strategies that can be used to inexpensively gain neuromarketing insights for your business. Response time studies. Timing synchronization software can be used to measure response times in thousandths of a second. Whether carried out online or in a computer lab, response time studies can provide the inexpensive insights into brand association, product pop-out in shopping contexts. Online services, eye tracking and facial expression analysis. Online studies can now incorporate both eye tracking and facial expression recognition through the use of webcams or built-in computer cameras. Combined with clever experimental designs, gamification, putting game elements into online experiments, and crowdsourcing, using virtual betting to predict marketplace outcomes, these capabilities provide opportunities to test thousands of online study participants cheaply and quickly. Behavioral experiments. Behavioral economics provides insights and principles about how people make decisions in real-world situations. We show how you can set up and run behavioral experiments in your store or on your website, testing the results of different configurations relatively quickly and easily. Chapter 2. Succeeding in Neuromarketing. Part 5 is devoted to practical and ethical issues relating to neuromarketing research. In Chapter 19, we identify 5 practical aspects of neuromarketing studies that you need to understand if you want to get the most out of working with a neuromarketing vendor. Because neuromarketing is a new field, you'll want to be sure your vendor has a solid foundation in each of these areas. Experimental design. Is your experiment designed to efficiently test hypotheses and control for external factors that could confound or blur study results? Measurement validity and reliability. The extent to which your vendor's metrics have been tested to answer 2 key questions. Do they measure what the vendor says they measure, and are they generalizable to new samples and future situations? Safeguard against reverse inference. This term refers to a common type of logical interference in neuromarketing studies. If brain signal A is active, then mental state B must be active. But even if mental state B is always accompanied by brain signal A, it does not follow logically that every time brain signal A is active, mental state B must also be active. Brain signal A can be occurring for other reasons. Your vendor needs to be able to explain if and how it handles this inferent challenge. Statistical significance. Proper statistical tests need to be applied to determine the probability that a result is not produced by chance. Given the complexity of many neuromarketing designs, the proper tests are not always easy to identify. Normative data, comparative benchmarks. Can your vendor provide data that correlates its measures with behavioral measures of marketing success? For example, advertising research companies usually provide normative data comparing scores on their metrics to product sales or other performance measures in the weeks after tested ads are shown. What normative data does your neuromarketing vendor have to show the predictive value of its measures? We also propose that you review a simple but critical pre-flight checklist before you begin putting your effort on any sort of neuromarketing study. The checklist consists of 5 questions. First, are you testing the right hypothesis? Second, do you have the right experimental design? Third, are you testing the right materials? Fourth, are you sampling from the right population? Fifth, do you know how you'll use your results? With the information covered in this book, we believe you'll be fully equipped to answer each of these questions and conduct a valid, reliable, and insightful neuromarketing study. We provide more details about each question in Chapter 20. Two lessons remain in learning how to succeed with neuromarketing studies: how to pick the right partner to help you conduct neuromarketing research, and how to make sure any neuromarketing studies you do meet the highest ethical standards. In Chapter 21, we look at how to pick the best neuromarketing partner for your needs. As the field matures, we're seeing the emergence of two types of partners you can consider. Neuromarketing vendors. These are firms that perform neuromarketing studies for you using their methodologies of choice. Each vendor brings its own expertise and experience to your study, and vendors tend to work in relative isolation from each other. Neuromarketing consultants. These are a different breed of service providers that are beginning to appear on the neuromarketing scene. Neuromarketing consultants don't perform studies themselves. Instead, they provide advice and counsel to companies and firms that want to conduct neuromarketing studies or a larger research program but want a partner to help them do many of the things covered in this book. Pick the right vendors, ask the right questions, look after the project, and then, of course, come up with your neutral understanding of the results. Neuromarketing consultants sometimes act as general contractors, assembling the research team, providing oversight of the project, and helping integrate the results into your business decision-making. Details about these two types of partners and the pros and cons of using each are discussed in detail in Chapter 21. For some potential users of neuromarketing, the most important issues surrounding its adoption are ethical, not methodological or organizational. Due to the controversies that have followed neuromarketing over the years, many marketers want to know if neuromarketing has the same ethical foundations and standards that other market research disciplines have. In Chapter 22, we outline a set of ethical safeguards and principles that we believe every neuromarketing vendor should adopt to ensure that every study is safe, accurately portrayed, and trustworthy. Many of these safeguards and principles have been introduced by others, including distinguished neuroethicists. We summarize them under three key principles: protecting the rights of research participants, including confidentiality, full disclosure, and safety, in line with the guidelines of different nature issued by the U.S. Health and Human Services Department and other regulatory agencies around the world, representing research and results fairly and accurately in all media and marketing communications, providing evidence for the validity and reliability of all neurometric and biometric measures to potential buyers of neuromarketing services. In addition, we discuss the emergence of industry standards for neuromarketing from research organizations such as ISOMAR and the ARF, which is Advertising Research Foundation to be specific. We look in detail at the Neurostandards Initiative for Advertising Research launched by the ARF and sponsored by some of the most respected advertisers in the world. Finally, we revisit some important legal, social, and policy questions relating to neuromarketing. We argue, based on the evidence we have assembled in this book, that neuromarketing is a legitimate form of market research that will continue to increase in popularity and provide value to the marketing community. It isn't brainwashing or a conspiracy to make people overbuy or overconsume. It needs to be conducted ethically under the same standards as any other research methodology. We're optimistic about the future of neuromarketing and believe it can be a source of good for society. We close Part 5 by discussing 3 areas where neuromarketing can have a positive impact on public policy: in public service advertising, in public policy design and implementation, and in education. Neuromarketing is a new way to think about marketing. It has emerged over the last decade because the brain sciences, especially the fields of neuroscience, behavioral economics, and social psychology, have provided us with a new and challenging picture of how human beings think, decide, and act in the real world. As we show in the next chapter, what it tells us is that much of what we thought was true about consumer thinking and behavior is actually wrong. Chapter 3: New Findings of Neuromarketing. Understanding neuromarketing means accepting some radical new ideas that are very different from traditional ways of thinking about consumers, marketing, and advertising. In this chapter, we give you all the basics you need to know about the old way of thinking about thinking and the new way that led to neuromarketing. We start by looking at advertising because advertising research was the first type of marketing research to appear. We review how people have looked at advertising for years so you have a sense of how this kind of research developed. We show that this research was based on a picture of how the consumer thought and made decisions, called the rational consumer model. Then we show you what brain science has discovered about how people actually perceive and interpret the world, because when you understand that, you know why neuromarketing has emerged hand in hand with the new science. Finally, we end the chapter by proposing a new way of thinking about the consumer, the intuitive consumer model. How we used to think about consumers. In the good old days, before brain science started making things more complicated, marketers tended to think of consumers as basically rational information processors with a little bit of irrational emotion thrown in. This rational consumer model may remind you of a character from Star Trek, pointy-eared and super logical Mr. Spock. In this section, we use Spock to explain the rational consumer model. Then we explain how early ideas about advertising and marketing were designed around this model of the consumer. We delve into how the effectiveness of marketing and advertising was tested, and we point out the flaws of this old way of viewing consumers. The rational consumer. Mr. Spock goes shopping. Mr. Spock aspires to be a purely rational and logical decision-maker, often to the irritation of fellow crewman, Dr. McCoy, the ship's physician, who relies more on emotions to make decisions. Although consumers actually act a lot more like Dr. McCoy than Mr. Spock, the rational consumer model was the gold standard for years. Consider the attributes that logical Mr. Spock would bring to the shopping experience. Mr. Spock thinks in terms of information. His brain seeks information, stores information, and retrieves information to make decisions. Mr. Spock is aware of different brands and products because he's been collecting and remembering information about them throughout his lifetime. Mr. Spock can retrieve this information completely and accurately at any point after he has encountered it. His brain operates like a computer hard drive. Mr. Spock rationally determines his preferences. Among any set of alternatives, Mr. Spock's preferences are clear, unambiguous, and unchanging as long as the attributes of the alternatives don't change. Mr. Spock uses cost-benefit calculations to make a purchase decision at the point of purchase. These calculations determine, for example, whether Mr. Spock will place brand A or brand B in his shopping cart. Mr. Spock's preferences can be changed if and only if he is presented with new information that alters his beliefs about products. Mr. Spock can be influenced to change his behavior, but only if he is persuaded that his previous beliefs were wrong. Marketing and advertising communications are messages that present rational, logical arguments about brands and products. These communications are designed to persuade Mr. Spock to choose product A over product B at the point of purchase. When he remembers them, he can apply them in his purchase decision cost-benefit calculation. Modern neuroscience, social psychology, and behavioral economics have raised powerful objections to each of these assumptions. In the next section, we show how these assumptions have impacted marketing and advertising research for over a century. Rational models for rational marketing to rational consumers, early pioneers of marketing and advertising research must have had something very similar to this rational consumer model in mind when they formulated the first advertising effectiveness theories at the start of the 20th century. These theories were derived from the best model of successful persuasion available at the time, the door-to-door salesman. In 1903, advertising was famously defined as salesmanship in print. Most advertising in those early days was designed to simulate the door-to-door salesman, rapidly conveying a persuasive message for the purpose of converting a probable buyer into a confirmed sale or real buyer. Selling through advertising was viewed as a rational, information-based process with no place for emotional appeals or what we now call creative in advertising. Like a good door-to-door salesman, a good ad delivered as much information as required, made a persuasive argument for the product, and then explained how to buy the product. That was how it worked. The ADA model was one of the first translations of sales strategy into advertising strategy. Lewis's insight was that advertising worked through a hierarchy of effects that had to be achieved in a fixed order to produce positive results. The acronym for this model was AIDA, ADA, derived from each of the 4 steps. First, attention. First, make your customer aware of your product. Second, interest. Next, pique your customer's interest by demonstrating the advantages and benefits of your product. Third, desire. When interest is established, convince your customer that he or she wants or desires your product to satisfy his or her needs. Fourth, action. Finally, lead your customer to take the actions required to purchase your product. Several other models were developed over the following decades by both academics and practitioners that presented different kinds of hierarchy of effects models, all of which were variations of the original ADA model. For example, in 1961, Roger Colley wrote that advertising moves people from unawareness, to comprehension, to conviction, to desire, to action. All these formulas for advertising success viewed the consumer as a rational, information-processing Mr. Spock. Information triggered attention, generated interest, drove desire, and motivated action. The trick of advertising, and later marketing, was to send messages to the consumer that would guide this journey from unawareness to purchase. The trick of advertising and marketing research, in turn, was to measure whether these effects were occurring. Measuring effectiveness the old-fashioned way, over the last century, researchers developed and refined various tools and methodologies to test marketing and advertising methods for their precision and accuracy. Because researchers believed that the rational consumer was engaged in conscious, rational calculations, the natural way for them to learn about those calculations was just to collect the information from consumer about their personal opinions. 3 methodological traditions from the bedrock of traditional market research techniques used to gather information about what consumers think about messages, products, and brands. Interviews. Interviewing techniques include a wide variety of methods, from quick mall intercepts to intensive depth interviews that probe the deep sources of consumer desires and needs. All are characterized by a face-to-face interaction between a subject, the person being interviewed, and an interviewer, the person asking the questions. Focus groups. There is a group that is equivalent to the natural extension of interviewing, and they are commonly known as a focus group. Instead of interviewing one consumer at a time, focus groups bring a group of consumers together under the direction of a moderator who guides a group discussion of the topic under consideration, such as candidate ads, a new product idea, or a comparison of product brands in a particular category. The idea is that the interactive nature of the discussion will uncover additional insights that interviewing consumers in isolation would miss. Consumer surveys. Consumer surveys are structured questionnaires designed and administered to elicit answers to questions in a controlled and generalizable way. Properly executed, surveys can accurately estimate the opinions of millions of people from a sample of hundreds. From door-to-door surveys to telephone surveys to online surveys, this technique has been the mainstay technique of market research since the 1940s. All these methods share 2 important attributes. They rely on people's verbal self-reports, what people say, to identify their attitudes, preferences, and behaviors, and they depend on people's memories to accurately recall what they've done or thought in the past. Chapter 4. New models based on neuromarketing. When rational models fail. Everybody in the market research business knows that self-reporting measures, whether derived from interviews, focus groups, or surveys, often produce misleading results, send researchers in the wrong direction, and result in ads that don't have any impact or in products that linger on the shelves. Traditional market researchers tend to see these problems as fixable with better techniques and controls, for example, more clever question wording in surveys or larger, more representative samples of consumers being surveyed. These improvements are worthwhile, and they continue to have a positive impact on the quality and usefulness of these methodologies. Neuromarketing researchers take a more radical view and see things somewhat differently. They recognize a number of flaws in the self-reporting model that can't be fixed with incremental improvements. These flaws revolve around the concept of accessibility. Self-report measures assume, following the rational consumer model, that people have conscious accessibility to their mental states. That is, they know what they know. A vast amount of research shows conclusively that people don't actually know what they know. In fact, people often don't know the real reasons why they do things or have certain attitudes or opinions. Their mental processes involving perception, evaluation and motivation may never reach the level of conscious awareness. This is the fundamental dilemma of market research that neuromarketing addresses. By bringing the insights of brain science to the world of consumer attitudes and behaviors, neuromarketing is building a portfolio of research techniques and methodologies that are grounded in more realistic assumptions than the models that underlie traditional market research tools. Replacing rational model with intuitive consumer model. We began this chapter by referencing Mr. Spock, the superlogical first officer on the Starship Enterprise on the TV show Star Trek. We made the case that Mr. Spock could be the poster boy for the rational consumer model that has informed marketing and market research for most of the last century. Given what we've learned from the brain sciences of neuroscience, social psychology and behavioral economics, it makes sense to consider retiring the rational consumer and replacing it with a much more realistic intuitive consumer model. Once again, we have a character from Star Trek who nicely represents this new ideal, the emotion-driven chief medical officer on the Starship Enterprise, Dr. McCoy. Unlike Mr. Spock, Dr. McCoy makes his decisions based on his emotional responses to situations. He knows in his gut the right thing to do, even if he can't articulate it clearly. In contrast to Mr. Spock, let's imagine how Dr. McCoy would go shopping. Unlike Mr. Spock, Dr. McCoy doesn't do a lot of deliberate thinking about the products he buys at the grocery store. His brain uses habit, experience, and emotional cues as shortcuts to making decisions. Emotions play the dominant part in these processes. He doesn't have deep explicit memories about different products and brands, nor could he tell you what claims were made in most advertising he sees. Dr. McCoy retrieves feelings about products and brands and, to a limited extent, factual information in a loose and spotty manner. Much of this process is below his conscious awareness, so he can't recount it accurately. Dr. McCoy doesn't usually subject his preferences to careful logical analysis. In fact, he often infers his preferences from his behavior rather than the other way around. Among any set of alternatives, Dr. McCoy's preferences may be logically inconsistent. He may prefer brand A to brand B and brand B to brand C, but also prefer brand C to brand A. If you asked him why he put brand A instead of brand B in his shopping cart, he probably couldn't give you a good reason unless he made one up. Dr. McCoy's shopping behavior can be changed, but overt persuasion through logical argument is surprisingly ineffective. When he recognizes that you're trying to persuade him, he tends to put up cognitive defenses and becomes less, not more receptive to your message. Dr. McCoy will swear to you that advertising has no effect on his behavior, but like most of his self-assessments, this one will probably be wrong. The primary way that marketing and advertising influence Dr. McCoy is indirectly through repetitive association of positive themes and images with the advertised brand or product. Only if he's actively considering the purchase of a particular product will he consciously seek out, pay attention to, and commit to memory information and persuasive arguments about products in his area of interest. The intuitive consumer model represented by Dr. McCoy creates many new research challenges, but it also provides a much more realistic guide for marketing and market research professionals. Neuromarketing is about embracing and exploring how this model works to develop better predictive theories and measures of how real consumers make real decisions, as well as to make decisions that can be termed real according to modern marketing standards. Conclusion. Our brain is gifted with the task of interpreting and understanding anything and everything that it comes across, be it a situation or an object. The ease with which this understanding is done is termed as processing fluency. It impacts our ability to form impressions and determine meaning and value. Like familiarity, processing fluency tends to increase positive feelings, but it does so using a different mechanism. Familiarity creates liking through frequency of exposure, while processing fluency does so through ease of processing. Numerous experiments have shown that processing fluency can have powerful effects on people's judgments and decisions, many of which are extremely relevant for marketing and market research. Familiarity and liking. Ironically, when something has high processing fluency, it can appear to be more familiar even if it is not, causing people to feel more positively toward it than if it were less easy to process. Truth. Arguments and statements that are easy to read are more likely to be seen as true. Factual statements presented in easy-to-read colors are judged to be true more often than when presented in hard-to-read colors. Folk sayings presented as rhymes are rated as more truthful than those that don't rhyme. Beauty. Faces that are more symmetrical are seen as more attractive. Objects that have more symmetry, more contrast between foreground and background, and more predictable patterns are rated as more aesthetically pleasing. Risk. New initial public offering (IPO) companies that have pronounceable stock symbols, for example KAR, perform better in their first 6 months than companies with unpronounceable symbols, for example XXY. Scrutiny and learning. Easy-to-process materials are less likely to be carefully scrutinized. Conversely, disfluency triggers more scrutiny, more attention to detail, and better memory retention. Students who read lessons in hard-to-read fonts achieved higher test scores than students who read the same lessons in easier-to-read fonts. As with the effects of familiarity and repetition on liking, these misattribution effects of processing fluency tend to go unrecognized because they occur non-consciously. Interestingly, when they're explained to people, the effects tend to go away. So we're capable of discounting processing fluency effects, but we need to be aware of them in order to do so. And it's probably true that neither marketers nor consumers are aware of many of these effects and their inadvertent impacts on consumer judgments, decisions, and behavior. Some obvious neuromarketing tips follow from these examples of processing fluency. If you want to give your customers a good head start toward liking your new product. When presenting your product in a new ad, keep it simple and remember that the fluency or disfluency of how you talk about your product may transfer to the product itself. When presenting product information in marketing communications, format and display your message in a way that facilitates easy processing short sentences, lots of white space, graphical illustrations, and so on. For policymakers and regulators, pay attention to fluency effects when communicating to consumers about potential hazards. Be aware that a hazardous product may be perceived as safe